According to the World Bank's GCC Economic Update report, Qatar's GDP is expected to rise 4.9% this year, thanks to a 10% increase in hydrocarbon exports. Overall, the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on the commodity markets and the economic sanctions that resulted are favorable for Qatar's economy, which is the largest exporter of liquid natural gas globally. So, how did we reach here? And how is Qatar profiting from the Russia-Ukraine war? Here's how. Qatar's geopolitical approach has been to forge broad alliances, which have at times appeared conflicting, but have also allowed it to play a uniquely useful role. For instance, it is home to the United States Central Command Forward Headquarters for the Middle East, yet the Taliban also trust it. This helped them to plan evacuations from Kabul following the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. It is friendly with both rival Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, and has an effective working relationship with Israel, despite adhering to the Arab Peace Initiative as the criteria for considering normalizing ties, allowing it to de-escalate conflict on the Gaza border and provide energy, housing, and humanitarian aid on multiple occasions. Qatar has numerous points of communication with Russia. The Gas Exporting Countries Forum, which, unlike OPEC, is a talking shop rather than a market mover, is led by Qatar and Russia. Qatar Investment Authority has also become a big investor in Russia, collaborating with the Russian Direct Investment Fund. In 2016, Qatar made the highest single investment, purchasing a 19% interest in Russian oil major Rosneft for almost $11 billion. That may appear to be an odd option, but Qatar's crude oil production is declining, so it might be reviewed as diversification of its gas-dominated hydrocarbon portfolio. Qatar invested in Russia's second-largest bank, VTB Bank, in its initial public offering in 2013 and remains the country's second-largest foreign investor with a 0.5% share. In 2018, Qatar purchased a 25% stake in Moscow's Vnukovo Airport. Qatar has developed these ties with Russia despite competing with it in gas markets and fiercely disagreeing with it on a number of geopolitical matters, most notably in Syria, where Qatar has been the most vocal Arab critic of President Bashar al-Assad. As previously said, these tensions are a feature, not a flaw, of Qatar's diplomacy, and Doha may play a role in the coming months, as it had in previous confrontations. Other Gulf governments that straddle the Russia-West divide, such as Saudi Arabia, which jointly drives oil policy with Russia, and the United Arab Emirates, Russia's primary economic partner in the Gulf Cooperation Council and a current United Nations Security Council member, could also play a role. Energy-related concerns and geopolitical and ideological considerations greatly influence Qatar's view on the Ukraine crisis. Doha might benefit significantly as a gas producer, given that the Gulf country competes with Russia in this sector. Europeans are turning to Qatar and other gas-rich countries like Algeria, Azerbaijan, Norway, and the United States to diversify their gas suppliers away from Russia. This war is actually serving Qatar interests, Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor at King's College London, said. He predicted that European partners would be looking for alternatives, with Qatar being one of those alternate LNG and gas sources. Realistically, Qatar cannot replace Russian supplies, but it can assist European countries in diversifying their gas import sources. EU states, such as Italy, are particularly concerned about the likelihood of Western sanctions against Russia causing gas shortages, blackouts, energy price increases, and commodity flow disruption. During this international crisis, they are especially eager to resort to Qatar and other gas-exporting states. For example, shortly after visiting Algeria, Rome's top diplomat, Luigi Di Maio, and Claudio Descalzi, CEO of Eni, an Italian multinational gas and oil corporation, visited Doha on March 5th to discuss Italian-Qatari energy cooperation. Similarly, Qatar stated at the end of November that it would supply more liquefied natural gas to Germany beginning in 2026. Earlier this year, Habeck visited Qatar and had political framework talks. Chancellor Olaf Scholz then mentioned progress in LNG supply discussions during his September visit to Qatar. The planned volume might cover around 3% of annual demand. The ongoing expansion of Qatar's liquefied natural gas capacity may translate into exports that displace some Russian gas sales in Europe by the mid-2020s, said Lee Chen Sim, an assistant professor at Khalifa University. Only 14% of Qatar's LNG was sold on short-term contracts or as individual cargo spot sales in 2020. In comparison, 37% of Australian LNG, 68% of US LNG, and 49% of other LNG were sold on the spot market or through short-term contracts. In 2020, the United States and Australia sold 5 times as many spots or short-term LNG as Qatar, and the ratio is even greater now that new U.S. terminals have increased output to about 80 million tons per year and will reach 100 million tons per year by the end of 2022. In reality, the United States has recently eclipsed Qatar as the world's biggest LNG producer. This is why, in January, a record number of LNG carriers across the Atlantic transporting 3/4 of U.S. LNG to Europe. In 2021, the tide began to rise in the gas market. Gazprom contributed to this run-up by refusing to sell more quantities to Europe beyond what they usually agreed, causing reserves to be depleted. Furthermore, there was a geopolitical premium on gas long before Putin sent soldiers into Ukraine, due to concerns about supply disruptions if Russia reduced shipments, sanctions prohibited them, or pipelines were delayed by conflict. However, external circumstances played a role as global energy demand recovered from the pandemic, and, unlike in the oil sector, there was not a big amount of untapped capacity to quickly put online, which was exacerbated by periods of bad weather and supplier disruptions. Despite this, when the Northern Hemisphere winter came to an end, prices began to fall, as they generally do in the spring, to a 6-month low of around $24 per million BTU. However, European gas prices roughly doubled once Russia troops entered the Donbass on February 21st, followed by a larger invasion on February 24th. In contrast, Qatari LNG primarily goes to Asia. This is due in part to historical relationships with Japanese and Korean firms, which aided in the construction of the existing LNG trains. However, a problem arose in 2018 when the European Commission opened an antitrust investigation against Qatar's contracts, citing typical destination clauses that forced the buyer to use the gas rather than resell it. Japan and others have criticized these clauses, but they are particularly problematic in Europe's shared energy market. There has been speculation in recent months that Asian consumers may offer special authorization to shift some of their contracted LNG from Qatar to Europe in the case of a crisis. This was part of the Biden-Temin summit, and the U.S. contacted Japan about it in early February. These plans could be implemented shortly in a reversal of the situation following the 2021 tsunami and Fukushima nuclear tragedy, when some European consumers allowed Qatar to temporarily redirect exports to Japan to compensate for its nuclear outage. Nonetheless, the amounts expected to be available would be a fraction of the U.S. spot market supply to Europe, let alone Russian imports. Right now, Qatar and indeed the LNG market as a whole lack the ability to replace Europe's Russian gas imports. At the end of the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, Kaabi stated that Qatar might currently divert 10 to 15% of its LNG to Europe. Longer term, as the Golden Pass and North Field expansion projects enter the market, Qatar might play a critical role in diversifying European gas supplies away from Russia. The European Commission's investigation into Qatar's contracts have been dropped, which is a significant milestone. This removes a huge barrier, and Kaabi specifically stated in his news conference following the forum that the North Field expansion was meant for consumers in Asia and Europe. Previously, Qatar Energy had focused nearly completely on Asia. In principle, the North Field extension and Golden Pass could replace nearly half of Russia's gas exports to Europe. If Europe constructs enough LNG import terminals, US and Qatari LNG might completely replace Russian shipments. This maximalist scenario is implausible, given robust LNG demand in China and elsewhere, and the likelihood of a resolution with Russia before more new LNG enters service. However, increased European demand may help Qatar secure a slew of attractive long-term supply agreements this year for both existing and future gas output.